Good evening, everyone. My name is Patricia Ellingwood, and thank you for joining us for the second of two webinars in our extended grazing series. Tonight, we're going to discuss extending the season with cover crop grazing. And joining us tonight are Joe Dickinson, Birgit Martin, and Mike Swiderski. And so without further ado, I am going to pass the floor to Joe Dickinson.
Thank you everybody for coming. Okay, what we're going to talk about today is extending the grazing season and some of the different ways you can do it. Primarily, I'm going to be focusing on different varieties we can be looking at. Um, Obviously, we can't get too far into it with the time frame that we have, but at least I can give you some ideas and some thought processes to go forward. Um, The photo here was from last fall. We were extending with a combination of bale grazing and that's Italian ryegrass there um, amongst the bales that Odie's playing in. And the cows were doing a pretty good job adding some organic matter to that field. So what I'm going to touch on is some of the growth patterns and why these are important. Um, Plants that are going to help us with that early emergence, some that are going to help us in that midsummer slump, and then some that will give us that late season feed. And I'm going to start off with this slide here, and I'm going to keep coming back to it. Basically, what we are looking for here, that little X is in the wrong spot, but we'll move forward anyhow. Um, what we want to do is we want that X to be along the X-axis, a little bit further up, probably towards the T on shoot. And that's what we're going to be shooting for at the start of the spring period. Um, Cool season plants and the warm season plants, what we're talking about there is our cool season are most of our grasses. And the warm season are things like sorghum, corn, millet, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. So how do we get this early start? Um, and what are some crops that we can use to give us a good chance here? In some cases, we're going to be able to take advantage of crops that were seeded the year before. In the case of red clover, we're probably going to be putting that down on a stand of wheat the spring prior. And if you didn't plow it down or kill it in some way after your crop came off, and you just let that go through to the end of the year and over winter again, that can give you a really nice um, boost in early spring. Red clover as a legume, it's a great fixer in nitrogen. It's a biennial, but we have to be really careful of bloat. Birgit's going to be talking about that later on. I'm not going to get into the weeds too much on it, but just something to keep in mind. Carrying on with the legumes, Austrian winter peas are another one that if we're seeding that in late summer or fall, plant that say after a wheat field, plant that after corn silage potentially if you're far enough south. Um, they can get going. They're going to overwinter. They'll fix some nitrogen for you, and if they get enough top growth, they can give you that feed in the new year. Hairy vetch is fairly similar. Again, it's another legume, nitrogen fixer. It's a phosphorus scavenger. There's less risk of bloat, but there still is a risk. And again, you're looking at planting that late summer, early fall. Sweet clover, similar to red clover. It's a nitrogen fixer, high risk of bloat. If you're doing hay, there's a risk of sweet clover poisoning due to mold, but if you're pasturing it, that risk is a lot less. Now let's get into some of the grasses. We can look at Phaceololium, which is fescue or either meadow or tall, blended with Italian ryegrass. The tall fescue hybrid is better suited to overwintering. And so that's one, again, that we can plant in the summer or fall, have it get through the fall, do some growth there over winter, and start perking up in the spring and give you that early feed. And a couple others are the hybrid brassica, which is a cross of forage turnips and forage rape. Um, Fall rye, which is a cereal that most of us are familiar with. It really does like that wet, cold climate that comes with our springs, and it can really take off. Winter triticale is another one. And of course, annual ryegrass is is another option. Annual rye, it's a biennial again, so it's going to give you something the second year, but don't plan on it for the next year. It's not a perennial. The biggest thing with a lot of these crops that we're looking at for giving us feed in the early start of the year is we're looking at either winter seeded, fall seeded annuals or biennials. And just remember, they're here for a good time. They're not here for a long time. And that's so we want to make sure we can take advantage of that when they're there. So now we're moving on and we're looking at the warm season plants. And this again should be right in line with that, with the peak on the red curve there. So we know that a lot of times our summer is going to have a droughty season where those cool season grasses kind of slow down a little bit on growth. And how do we extend that season and possibly give our pastures a little bit extra time before we go into the next flush of really nice weather for grazing them? There's a few ways we can do it. Hay fields are one option. If you're going to be feeding that feed to the cattle anyhow, you can burn fuel or you can move fences if it's a situation where you can access it. And I mean, with the price of diesel right now, if that's an option, you might as well look at it. We're also looking at those warm season annuals. So things like sorghum sudan grass or millet, they do a phenomenal job getting going, um, getting going a little bit later. So that gives you a longer planting window. But once they get going, they really take off, and you should be able to get some pretty nice growth out of them by midsummer. And livestock generally do pretty well on them, and they will regrow pretty nicely when they're being grazed. And then we're getting into the fall. Um, that X is probably the closest of any of them in terms of where I'd like it to be. Basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to extend beyond that little bump that we get with the cool season plants. And as a result, we're trying to stretch that time that we can keep our livestock out on pasture as long as possible. There's a few ways we can do this. We can be grazing stubble, or we can be looking at some of these other crops. So the critical fall harvest period is going to be one that we really want to keep in mind when we're setting ourselves up the for the winter. If we're thinking about our field, whether it be pasture or whether it be as hay, and we're cutting it too early, what we're doing is we're not giving that field enough time to recover. And as a result, we can reduce the reserves over the course of the year. The biggest thing we want to keep in mind, though, as we get to the near the end of our um, productive production cycle for the year, We need to know roughly when our killing frost is going to be. And if we're looking at alfalfa, we want to move that final cut, whether it be with a machine or whether it be with your livestock, to be 6 weeks prior to that final cut. If you're using a trefoil based forage, you want to move that an extra week earlier. So 7 weeks. And so that's something you want to keep in mind because basically what's happening those first 3 weeks after the cut, that crop is trying to get that top growth to help insulate itself over the winter. And then the following 3 weeks or 4 weeks is when it's building up those root reserves to get through the wintertime. So ways we can extend the grazing season. I talked about sorghum. I will say we have to be very, very cautious with sorghum because when it gets hit with a frost, you can get nitrate poisoning for the first week afterwards. So make sure that um, you don't have anything out when frost is in the forecast. Clover, again, if it's already there from your wheat or what have you, or you're using it as a cover crop, it's one that very well might be at a point where you can do some grazing later on. But if you're doing that, you might not have access to it in the spring. Oats, peas, and barley are ones that work really nice either by themselves or as a group. And oats will grow down to 4 degrees Celsius. Barley will grow around 0. I've even heard numbers beyond that, um, which gives you an extended period of time when you can access some of that feed and keep the energy and the quality level up. Corn, we don't really look at as a cover crop for the most part, but if it is a crop that you've got in your rotation or you've planted it and for whatever reason you're not looking to harvest it, it is a fantastic crop for giving you lots of energy, lots of volume um, later on in the season. And winter triticale is another one of those that we're going to plant it late, or we're going to plant it in the fall. It's going to start growing, and we should have enough top growth um, where we can do some grazing before we have to shut it down for the rest of the winter. Okay, I believe that is my time.
Okay, so yeah, Mike Swiderski here. I'm from Melanchthon Township, Ontario, and I'm just gonna talk about a few of the things that I do on my farm, and we'll go from there. We do have a sheep, an annual lambing sheep farm, as well as we background yearlings, and I manage the local community pasture. So I'm going to start with a few things I hear on the street quite a bit. So as far as the grazing cover crops and crop residue go, I hear often there are no fences, water, or livestock handling infrastructure in my area. And I think unless you're over 100 years old, you've never actually witnessed any of that. So let's just turn the page right from the start that almost nobody in the province has fences or livestock infrastructure on their cropping area that can be used for crop residue and and um and cover crop grazing. And we can look at the opportunities here tonight. So the next thing is the land in my area is really expensive, so we can't do it. Well, I think if the land is expensive everywhere in the province here, so I think that's a great opportunity, and possibly even a great need to stack these enterprises, stock that cropping enterprise and that livestock enterprise, and get together with somebody with that land and make these opportunities happen. So those with livestock handling and grazing management knowledge have a great opportunity to benefit their business as well as others in their community. So I'm going to talk here quickly about how do you solve that perimeter fence issue. So I'm going to go back to kind of the basics. And this is a hydraulic winder for high tensile smooth wire. It's used in in Western Canada a lot for winding up barbed wire as well. If you notice in the center, it's got that um, cone feature, so you can take that wire off and reuse it. And this is used an item like this is used in Western Canada and through the Midwest United States. It's a staple. Every farmer will have one of these, and their people are still using and reusing that $50 roll of high tensile wire. It rolls it up easy. Um, and it can be reused and over and over and over again. And this is a very simple way to put up that one or two wire perimeter fence around cropping areas for short-term use. Um, Here at Range Ward, it's relatively new to Ontario, but it's been in Western Canada for a number of years, and they have, if you're doing big jobs, those large reels will electrically wind up wire. You can go around the perimeter, self-contained units with electric fence, as well as winding, and they do have small units um, for sheep and goats as well as cattle. Um, it's good to have some nice stuff coming here to Canada and Ontario that is, very, designed by grazers for grazers. And Rappa is now in Canada as well. If you like the last one, if you Google Rappa Canada, the contact information will come up. There's some awesome videos. So it will unwind um, wire three up to four wires, I believe, and it will wind up the wires as you drive that wheel like a wheel on a seed drill. It will wind that wire as you drive. Check out the YouTube video. There's a video of a French lady doing winding up wire at 30 kilometers an hour. This is if this technology in here was a tractor, it would be a 4020 John Deere. It's been in use, they've been in use for the 1970s and they're still being used today. So this is a proven UK technology that is finally getting here to Canada, but it's a great thing for us to have here. It can be mounted on ATVs, side by side, and as well they make a wheelbarrow model for small farmers, and it's a real handy piece of technology. And really with this, there's not really excuses for not having perimeter fences. Netting, it can be used in snow, fairly common. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the netting. It's good. It'll keep guard dogs in very well as the sheep. Um, I'm not going to talk about sort of the common reels we have here in the province. They're quite a staple. And finally, e-collars. Uh, if you like technology, it's a really good piece of technology for us. People keep coming up with more and more uses, whether it's bale grazing, cover crops, um, all sorts of things. I'm going to talk quickly about the economics, sort of the why. Why would we want to look into grazing cropped off aftermath cover crops? Um, Well, one of the main reasons is feed cost is the number one cost on most livestock farms. So if, as we look at it from a business standpoint, how do we save the 2% cost, the 5% cost? Well, this feed cost is a big one. So how do we make more money? Well, we try to lower our feed bills. So, and just as a point, the daily cost of grazing is generally half the cost of stored feed. So that this by eliminating those days on stored feed, it's a big one for profitability in your livestock business. On our farm, and I'm located in a low heat unit area in the snow belt, we now graze cover crops and crop residue 110 to 120 20 days per year. So it is like if I figure out 110 days of savings on my winter feed bill, it is major for us. Also allows us the ability to graze the yearling cattle we have at home. It allows us to remove the sheep and graze those cattle considerably longer, close to a month longer in the fall. It also allows us to, at the same time as grazing those cattle longer, it allows us to stockpile perennial pastures for our sheep to graze in around that Christmas time or in early spring. Like right now, we've had close to 10 inches of rain this month, and it lets me I can kick those sheep out in graze rather than feeding them hay and making mud. A great option to have. It allows us to observe that critical harvest period as Joe mentioned. And it also that harvest period also allows a bit of a disruption. It's a change in the management, and from with disruptions, often we see great results. It also provides clean grazing opportunities for managing parasites and coccidiosis, especially in that young stock. The feed quality of annual and biennial forages is superior to that of perennial forages in the later part of the year. I like to think that I can grow really good quality perennial grasses, and I think I can. But those biennials like red clover or oats and peas in that vegetative state, they allow really good gains on that young stock, and it really allows to put those really good high body condition scores on the mature breeding stock going into the winter. It's a great opportunity to get really good gains. We can put close to feedlot gains on lambs on red clover, for example. Access and opportunity. Got here, there's no such thing as free. Now, I've been listening to some of these webinars or presentations before, and people have been up there talking about how they're getting this free grazing from their crop neighbor. And that really kind of ticks me off because there's no such thing as free. It's not free to get the stock there, whether you're putting them on trucks or whether you're walking them. It's not free to the cropper. It's the man feeding and mineral salt isn't free. Moving fences isn't free. So I think it's far better to treat this as a as a business opportunity rather than a free lunch. I think to get started, I think it would be good to find a good way would be to find a neighbor or somebody local and try do a trial project and just sort of come up with some of the needs and goals of both people and just try it. And so identifying those needs of both parties, a common question is liability. Um, there's also thought on compaction concerns. That's and often something that the croppers will be concerned about is the stock um, causing compaction issues. Um, Fine. Discuss what's the entrance date and the exit date. And if you're putting stock on somebody else's land, make sure you get those bang on. Like it's a real respect thing and plan for those. Talk about the plant species that's going to go in. How much residue do they want? Some people like lots of residue, and also too much residue can be a problem for planting in the next spring, and and you also don't want to take it right off. And discuss that exit plan. Just because you can get your stock corralled and loaded up doesn't mean that your partner will know or even understand how that goes on. So it's important things to discuss. Fencing and watering, who's seeding, who's spraying, who's fertilizing, and then finally the compensation. What's it going to cost each person? And that's all I got. I'm gonna stop.
Okay, so I'm going to give some examples from our farm. And by that, I mean the farm here on Manitoulin Island. I farm with my husband, Jim, and two grown sons, Nick and Alex. We have a cow-calf through finish operation, and we do some custom grazing and a little bit of cash cropping as well. So I'm going to talk a little about how we bridge our slump in the summer with grazing hay aftermath, and how we extend our season in the fall with stockpiled pasture and also the grazing of cover crops and crop residues. And here's the curve again that Joe showed originally, and it comes to play strongly in our farm. We don't have any warm season species in our pasture program, so we use other mechanisms to bridge that slump. Regardless of what you're doing, you have to be flexible with a grazing system to be able to extend it and bridge it. Cool season pasture growth is at odds with livestock demand. Our peak growth is early in the spring and then another little bump in the fall. But particularly the peak in the spring is when the livestock are still, the calves are young, the lambs are young. And in the fall, when there's less growth, the calves are bigger, the lambs are bigger, the stockers are bigger, and there's less feed. So we have to compensate by either adding acres to the pasture system or removing livestock. So to add acres, you can add hay acres, you can add stockpiled pasture, you can harvest the excess and feed it back. You can also manipulate your fertilizing calendar. You can fertilize a little bit later, maybe in June, to push some growth in July and August. You can clip, which then stimulates some regrowth. And you can add the cover crops that we've been talking about here this evening, or residues as well, or plant some warm season species for the middle summer. The most challenging way probably to manage it is to remove livestock by pulling lambs, pulling calves, sending stockers on to finishing, etc. So it's easier to manage the grass, in my opinion, than it is to move livestock. So we can manage the growth. So the primary way that we bridge our summer slump is by bringing grazing hayfields, bringing hayfields into the rotation. We even graze the high legume content fields, alfalfa fields, or some that have red clover content as well. And we can do that without bloat concern. By the way we do it is we put the cattle into those pastures when the pasture is dry, so not in the morning, wait until the dew is off, and also put the cattle in when they're full, not when they're hungry. So if you can manage those two things, bloat risk should be minimized, and we haven't had bloat issues. By bringing hayfields into the rotation, it complements the pasture growth cycle. In the spring, pastures regrow far more quickly than they do in the fall. In the spring, regrowth is in about 20 days. In the fall, regrowth takes, or even late summer, regrowth takes 40 to 60 days. So adding the hay acres allows full regrowth opportunity for the pasture acres. It bridges that summer slump, and it also lets us then stockpile extra pasture acres. When we stockpile pasture, we're stockpiling for the fall or even next spring. Mike has mentioned that he does that as well on his operation. You basically let the pasture rest from July or August onward. And the quality of this stockpiled pasture, this is perennial pasture, is quite good. Christoph Wan did his master's thesis on this, and when he sampled pastures in right through November, right to late November. These are the types of crude protein and energy levels that he showed. And then again in the spring, in April, the crude protein and energy levels um, were very good compared to stored feed. And you can see in the bottom photo with the green shoots of new growth poking through the old residue. The residue is what provides the fill, and then the green shoots are what provide that burst of nutrition. So stockpiling is effective for both fall and spring. Specific species improve the late season quality of a stockpiled pasture. The fescues and bromes maintain their feed quality better late in the season, as does trefoil. And fescue also has a more upright structure, so it stays more accessible under snow cover or through snow cover. Other species can be better in season, but not late. So if you're planning some pasture mixes, plan for your stockpile pasture to have fescues, bromes, and trefoil in it. Stockpiling is highly weather dependent. It doesn't always work. The example on our farm that was very apparent was in 2018, starting in June. You can see that there was nice green growth. By August, we'd gone through about 6 or 7 weeks of drought. And we have a lot of shallow to bedrock pastures on Manitoulin, so there was virtually no growth whatsoever. So there was no stockpiling opportunity. Yes, we got rain, and yes, the pastures greened up again in the fall, but we were not able to extend the season beyond our regular season in that year. We also graze cover crops. Specifically, in our case, it's red clover. We frost seed red clover into all of our winter wheat acres in the spring. This is in September, and we have our custom grazed stalkers on the red clover. And to Mike's point about the nutritional quality of the cover crops, this is exceptional feed for these stalkers this late in the season. And then we also graze crop residues. We graze our cereal stubbles and also our corn stover. The photo on the left is of a group of dry cows in late November. They had a water tanker brought to this field, and they also got supplemented with a protein lick tub. The bottom right photo is oat stubble and oat regrowth, just a natural regrowth from after combining. And then top right, some cows with calves still on corn residue. And in this case, because the calves are still on these cows that are lactating, we also supplement them with a lick tub. And then once the manure no longer has corn in it, which was about a week in this case, they got supplemented again with hay, so that we're not pushing these cattle too hard, that they're still getting good nutrition, because these calves are May born and they wouldn't get weaned until about January. To Mike's point again, it's all about economics as to why we want to extend the grazing season. In our case, if we're looking at where we are, about $200 for a cow-calf pair for the summer, we can save about $1.50 per cow per day for every day that we can graze past 150 days. That's assuming hay is $60 a bale, which I know that varies widely across the province, especially from last year with the drought that many people experienced. But at $60 a bale, that's a savings of $1.50. So you can just do the math perhaps on your own hay costs as to what you would be saving by extending the grazing season. And this photo in the bottom right is December 23rd. This doesn't happen every year that we can graze that late. It's all weather dependent, but in this case, there wasn't too much snow and we had some stockpiled pasture. So the opportunities are great for extending the season right across the province in various different ways, to keep the cattle out, or sheep out as long as absolutely possible. And that ends my part as well, and I'll pass it back over to Patricia.
First question, and I think this is going to go to Joe in regard to species. Where do native grasses fit, like buffalo grass and big blue stems?
Yeah. So took took a couple minutes just to refresh my mind on them, Chris. Um, Obviously, it depends on which native grasses we're talking about. The two that you specifically mentioned are both native grasses that are warm season. So they're ones that would do a really nice job filling in that midsummer slump. Um, they are ones that do a nice job overwintering as well, but I wouldn't expect them to be the ones that are gonna take off nice and early in the summertime or in the springtime. As to the fall, the quality question, I can't answer that. I'm not familiar enough with those to say whether they maintain their quality. Maybe Mike or Birgit have some experience working with them.
No, we don't have any of those warm season grasses in our system, so I can't comment.
What about how do we get these seeds into the ground would a producer get some of these seeds into their mixes on their own operations?
The warm season grasses, Patricia?
It's a general question.
General?
So
Okay.
Dan, if you could provide some context, is there a specific crop that you're interested in?
If it's just generic, Patricia, frost seeding will work for legumes because they're small spherical seeds that make their way down to the ground, and then the freeze thaw action in the spring is what works them into the ground. Not highly successful for grasses because they're bulkier seeds and they tend not to be able to work their way down to the through the thatch and to the ground. Um, there's you can surface apply and then use the trampling effect of hooves also to get seed to the ground. You can use a pasture overseeder. It just depends on what technology I suppose you have available. To, and then um, base it on what, for example, um, Nipissing, no, not Nipissing, Perry Sound, Muskoka Perry Sound Soil and Crop Improvement Association has a pasture overseeder that they rent out to their members. So if you are fortunate to be in a situation where you have access to that, that's great. But there are other ways of seeding.
Okay, he does provide some context here. He says, how do we get the extra 100 to 120 days of grazing on our own properties? When do we put it in? How much per square? And do we need a no-till drill, etc.? So I think you have addressed.
Um, I think that's more so like the kind of species that you're grazing, Mike. And how are you,
Well,
where, how are you
uh,
seeding or is somebody else seeding for you?
yeah, and I'm not much of a farmer. I'm more of a grazer or a rancher. So I leave the whole seeding thing up to a professional, that which would be the crop farmer. And I think going back to, so I prefer to do it on somebody else's land. So then I can leverage somebody else's real estate rather than my own. But I think as far as if I did not have access to other land, I think it would be a matter of just changing the management on of my grazing throughout the whole year. So that would be probably stocking things a bit lighter. And as Birgit mentioned in hers, they're adding land, they're hay acres. I don't have hay acres on my own property too. I'd rather buy hay and just graze everything. So Birgit's adding hay acres. Um, Steve Kenyon, who he wrote a lot of this grazing mentorship work, and he uses the term disposable herd. And what that means, all of us have a disposable herd. It doesn't mean that we're gonna sell our favorite cow. What it means is that, and I'll give an example on my own farm. So we have yearling cattle and we have sheep. So we start the year grazing sheep. then our sheep have lambs. And so as that grass curve goes higher, we're adding more animals as the grass grows, and then we're adding quite a bunch of yearling cattle. But as that um growth slows, we're pulling stuff off just as quick. We're weaning lambs, we're pulling sheep off, then we're pulling yearlings off. So on another farm, that disposable herd might mean that maybe you've got cows and calves and maybe you've kept some heifers, but and you can move those heifers off, or you're moving cull cows off, or you're moving calves off. And that way, as the season goes and the quality decreases, you're having less animals on that land. And I think that's what I would do rather than rather than adding seed, because that seed, whether we're going to um, uh, frost seeding clover into our pastures, like the question is, why does that disappear? Well, it's a good chance it's going to disappear because of fertility in your pastures or your management. So before I added seed, I would definitely look into improving management and fertility rather than just putting seed down and then having to re-put seed down and re-put seed down year after year. I apologize for the long answer to that question.
Birgit or Joe, anything to add to that? No?
Sounds good to me.
So for a fall grazed wheat field seeded with red clover, what are your strategies for managing bloat?
Okay. Um, I know from my own experience, a couple things that you don't want to do is you don't want to move those animals on an empty stomach when that grass is wet, when that clover's wet. So trying to move them in the afternoon versus first thing in the morning generally helps. Other things that I've done in the past is keep a bale of some grassy first cut hay accessible to the cattle. Um, also generally helps. And what I also used to do was give a little bigger areas than I would otherwise. And that way, again, we're making sure that they're not getting hungry before the next move.
And on the sheep side, we've we do have a decent clover content in our perennial pastures, but we've done it all wrong. We've threw the textbook in the garbage, and we've had empty animals on clover that has had not even a sign of bud. So, and we've put weaned lambs, we've put ewes that we just pulled lambs off. We put them all on red clover, and I guess the first couple times, I guess I prayed a bit, but that's the only thing I did. And we haven't had bloat, and we do not have difficulty getting those sheep bred with anti-estrogen stuff. So I've done it all wrong, and we just kind of do it, and it would be my favorite cover crop to graze.
Awesome. So we all know there are significant benefits to the soil with cover crop grazing. There's someone that wants to convince their neighbor and is looking for data. Juliana Tyndall has provided a link to some impacts of cover crop grazing, but do any of you have anything to offer this person who's trying to convince their neighbor?
Yeah, I'll start on that, and thanks to Juliana, she may not know it, but she's kind of the authority on this right now. So keep watching what Juliana's doing with her work. I've been part of the Living Lab project. There've been a handful of sheep farmers and a handful of beef farmers throughout the province who've been grazing the last 2 years. Did a test plot where we grazed oats and peas, and they in a wheat, soybean, and corn rotation. And Juliana and her crew, they've been testing for compaction. They've been doing all kinds of soil tests, measuring carbon. And then they're following through onto the corn yields after the oats and peas. And I would say that the initial information is showing that there's not a whole lot of difference. Um, I think that compaction thing you need to be aware of. Like if you're running cattle and you probably want to pick a fairly well drained area. If you are prone to, if you do have sort of soils that are prone to compaction, pick and choose where you're gonna do it. Have a bit of an exit strategy if we do happen to get some of those tail ends of some of those hurricane rains in September and October, like we can get. From anecdotal evidence that we're seeing, um, some of the guys we're working with, they're seeing, I get a text or an email in, that late July when they're putting nitrogen on, and they're like, well, we're our tissue samples are saying that we need less nitrogen on the grazed cover crops as opposed to the standard non-treated areas. And another one is a number of times we've seen, I've got the text, and it's like, well, Mike, the field that you grazed last year, was the corn was planted later than the some of their better fields, and it's not our best farm, and it's been our best crop of corn. So there's some anecdotal stuff um, that has been really good. And the cash croppers who use cover crops on a regular basis, they kind of struggle with, they want a good cover crop, but they don't want, if it's ungrazed, they don't want too big of a cover crop because they have residue problems the next year. And it's kind of, to solve that problem would be to plant a big cover crop and graze it, because then that nutrient cycling, we're able to graze it down and make it available. And those are just a few things that I think would be some of the sales pitch I would use.
That's a pretty good pitch.
Great.
Um, have any of you ever tried putting a grass like Italian ryegrass with red clover when frost seeding into wheat?
No.
No.
The only place I saw that was on irrigated land in Lethbridge, and that's over 25 years ago, where a guy I was working for, he was actually planting spring barley underseeded with Italian ryegrass. And if you can add water, a wet year, I think it probably would work actually really, really good. Maybe you can be the first to try it here and let us know. I think it sounds like maybe a good idea.
Is there a nitrate risk grazing lush oats around frosts in October?
Short answer, I did go back to BCRC and just take a quick look to confirm. And yes, there is a risk of nitrate poisoning with grazing cereals around the frost time. And it's just because of where those crops are in their development stage when the frost happens.
Now, Joe, if it was a very, like, if there was no or little nitrogen fertilizer applied to that, would that risk be lowered quite a bit?
I would think so, Mike. Um, Especially if we're using the oats almost more as a scavenger than to help clean things up. Um, I guess my reading of lush oats was looking at a little bit more pronounced crop. But if if I was doing it, I'd want to make sure that I had a bit of a blend going on there to help mitigate that. It's doesn't seem to be as big a risk, say, as sorghum, where I want to keep my cattle as far away from that field as possible for a week. But it's one you want to be cognizant of at least.
Okay, someone notes that you may enjoy the Kick the Hay Habit book by Jim Garish, so that's something to check out. And one final question as we wrap up. How do you value compensation to the crop farmer in the case of grazing your animals on the cover crop? Is there any monetary value to the animals will provide to the crop farmer that should be worked into the deal?
I think that one's for you, Mike.
Yeah, I think that question comes a lot. Like when in my presentation where I said, you need to find out what motivates uh, crop farmers, and I think a lot of the time it's managing that cover crop and getting them some value. It's not always that they're looking for the top dollar paid, whether it's grazing days or whatever. So it's very common for me to buy the seed in these relationships so that you can figure out what that seed cost is per acre. And um another way to value it is um you figure out what the custom grazing rates are in your area. And I know that's a tough one to come up with. Um and sort of it won't be the high custom graze rate because you're doing all the work, and then subtract there's no fences, so then that needs to be deducted, and there's no there's 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 no water infrastructure, so that needs to be deducted. So it would be a fraction of what sort of a custom grazing rate would be. And I know I haven't thrown out any real numbers, like any actual numbers, because I don't think that actually exists. I think it that conversation needs to come up with what the benefits are for everybody. And I look at my one neighbor that I've worked with for a number of years, and on my perennial pastures, we've gone from organic matter in the threes to the sevens, some high sevens now across all our farming acres. And I think, well, in my career, if I could raise, grazing some of this land every 3 years, if I could give them 1% organic matter, that would be that would be a big contribution for me to their farm. And so I think it's some of the it's not always the dollars and cents, it's what we can do in our communities to sort of work with our neighbors and flex that.
I'm impressed that you made it all the way through that without saying it depends.
Thank you. I do my best.